The other day, don't worry about Welcome to Delivering High Performance Collaboration. This conference is all about the dynamics of collaboration, teams, and partnerships. We have a few words of instruction. The chat box is available to post comments during the presentation. Also available is the Q&A box. Please type your questions there for the speaker. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. All material will be available for download in approximately 48 hours. You will need to download the WebEx player to play the recordings. We will send you the link for all this as soon as the recordings are available. Our presenter today is Dr. Ord Elliott. Ord brings more than 40 years of experience as an executive consultant and entrepreneur. He has successfully navigated complex political and cultural landscapes, advising executives on a broad set of business challenges from Fortune 100 companies to early-stage startups. As an internal consultant for Procter & Gamble, he was one of the chief architects of Procter & Gamble's breakthrough advancements in self-directed teams during the 1970s. He is the author of several books and publications, including The Future is Fluid Form, Practical Steps for Designing Flat, Flexible Organizations, and The Warrior's Silence. Ord, we welcome you to our conference today. The time is now yours.
Thank you, Dave. Let me get this up. Are we up here?
You are up, yes.
All right, thank you. Well, greetings. Let me give you a heads up as we begin today. You may find some of what I'm presenting difficult to buy into, but that's intentional on my part. I'll push the envelope and open the discussion I hope we'll have after. I start with the team leader role. One way to break into the management ranks is to take on an opportunity to lead a team. It's a chance to demonstrate the organizing and interpersonal skills we associate with successful managers. So when an opening occurs, we either find someone already qualified or we take that chance to test an individual who we think shows potential. But let me ask you, do you ever recall sending a team off without a designated leader, even with someone who's never been tested? I certainly don't. That would be an accident waiting to happen without someone devoted to focus and direct activity. But in the business world, accidents do happen. When I was at Procter & Gamble decades ago, we learned about the corporate legend that tells of an operator who accidentally left a mixing machine on too long, putting too much air in the soap. It was ivory soap, and it floated. It was a success more than a century ago, and it's still on the shelf today. My story of leaderless teams is a true tale, not a legend. It happened. They were magically transformed into a swarm that soundly beat the heavily stacked odds against them. And much like ivory soap, their surprisingly successful result seemed more of an accident, about as likely as winning the lottery. There are two parts to my talk. The first is this true tale of a product development challenge in a high-tech company. In the second, I draw on this one event to question our assumptions about leadership and hierarchical management. Then I'll take an even bigger leap into the future to speculate about building self-managing networks with an invisible approach to change. Magic? Illusion? I'll leave that for you to decide later. Here's my true tale of leaderless teams. A Silicon Valley network storage company that I will call StoreServe faced a brutal life or death challenge. In 6 months, a competitor was coming out with a new server that had superior performance and features that would obsolete StoreServe's current product. They were going to get leapfrogged. And they knew that none of their customers would still be their customers 6 months down the road unless they had something better or comparable to offer. They had recently begun development on a new product, but their typical product development best was 13 months from concept to product. So at that rate, they would be 7 months behind their main competitor to the marketplace. They did put a stake in the ground to get this done in 5 months. But here's the hitch. There was no new development strategy whatsoever to make this happen. What they did know was that the next generation product needed a specific array of new features to be competitive. But the construction of these new features could not easily be accomplished without dialogue and trade-offs across the functional boundaries. But this company was functionally fragmented and siloed into many different departments, which was the main reason it took them so long to get new products out in the past. No surprise. You could feel the universal atmosphere of gloom. Nearly everyone was convinced that the company would go out of business, and this meant putting several thousand employees out of work. In desperation, the head of engineering decided to form 25 cross-functional teams composed of hardware and software engineers as a way of overcoming their historical functional gridlock. Each team was charged with building one of the features as part of the new product architecture. Of course, to achieve engineering milestones in one feature team, there might be trade-offs or choices another team would have to adjust to, or perhaps block in favor of their own objective. This process is typical of what you would expect to contend with across interdependent teams as they weigh choices and negotiate these trade-offs in the interest of building the best overall product. The approach is not revolutionary, of course. Cross-functional teams are a common method for getting the right people together to deal with interrelated issues. But of course, accomplishing this is a lot easier said than done. At this point, it looked as though they were at least going to have a long shot, but let's call it a very long shot at this accelerated schedule, except for one small detail. None of the teams had a member with experience leading a development like this. They were all young engineers spanning several cultures whose experience had only been as individual contributors. The company executives owned that they did not have the leadership depth to staff these teams. Eventually, 2 or 3 were lucky enough to get seasoned engineers that run projects. But the rest of the teams, which did indeed have smart young engineers, had that dazed look that suggested they didn't believe their leaderless team would ever pull off their assignment. This is when they brought me in to train is the word they used, each of the teams so they could do their job. The engineers in the few teams I visited initially had that deer in the headlights gaze. And here's the kicker. They told me I had only 4 hours with each team to accomplish this. I was unable to get them to understand that this was an accident waiting to happen. Despite my belief that this was a futile effort and not an endeavor I would likely want to attach my name to, I decided to give it the best shot I could. I started with what I might normally do to get a team up and running, which is lead them through a standard chartering process. So I covered 6 very basic areas that I have on the screen and added one unusual one I hope might make up some of the ground already lost for this lack of experienced team leaders. So as you can see, we're looking at objectives, what's in the scope, what the technical problems are, what cross teams they have to work with, do they have the talent, what are some initial action plans. And then the 7th new one, project leadership task allocation. This was the new one. I added this dimension because I was hoping to build just enough coordinating behavior to get these teams to some minimal operational capability. And I mean just enough to get moving. Although I had no idea at the time, it was this last element of the planning agenda, allocation of leadership tasks, that would make the difference between success and failure. To overcome this obvious leadership inadequacy, I pulled out a leadership assessment that I typically use for team leaders, a basic one, which focused on this very basic set of leadership tasks for projects. As you can see, not included were dimensions which would be part of a more complete team leader training, things like leadership style, understanding the group dynamics, etc. So the basics were, as you can see, things like define and prioritize key issues, decide on critical actions, stay on top of all of the project variables, maintain the interfaces between teams, and build confidence and energy, momentum. In each of the 25 teams, I had the team members filled it out based on their own capabilities on each of these 10. And then I took a poll on each item. The averages across all of the teams were in the very low 1 to 2 range. As they looked at their scores and the others, this already dazed look turned into one of panic. Everyone hunkered down, hoping not to get picked as the team leader. That would be the one who was going to take the blame for failure and the one whose career would receive the black mark. But I didn't target any single individual to be a team leader. It was clear from the outset that that wouldn't work. Instead of considering the leadership function as something for which one person must take complete responsibility, the 10 items on this team leadership assessment were each discussed in terms of who on the team could successfully manage not all 10, but at least one aspect of the team leader responsibility, just one. So, relieved of the fear of being a lone team leader, the atmosphere lightened up on all of these teams, and volunteers emerged who felt they had the skills and interests to manage 1, 2, or even 3 of these items. Of course, not all 10. So for most of the teams, a mix of engineers combined their abilities to fill the requirements for the entire list of 10. So the leader was not one person, there was not one team leader, but the leader was at least 3 or more who had taken responsibility for a small 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these items. More importantly, there was an emerging confidence that this distribution of leadership responsibilities might work adequately enough to focus and get work done. Not necessarily to achieve this very difficult 5-month development mark that they had put a stake in the ground for, but at least to move forward. So it wasn't time to throw in the towel yet. It would have been impossible to train individual leaders to do that job as an individual in this compressed 4-hour time frame, or 4 days, or 4 weeks, or 4 months. You pick what you would think it would take to train leaders from a base of talent who had no experience. Ironically, the very lack of capable leaders allowed for this unorthodox approach. This very chance occurrence raises an interesting question. Is team leadership a job with a defined skill set for one person? Or is it a set of skills and tasks that can be divided up among a number of individuals on a team who fulfill that traditional leadership role of one just as effectively? We don't normally consider shared leadership, as a practical approach. Is that because it is inherently inferior? Is it inherently inferior to having individuals who encompass this entire skill, or simply that we are accustomed to and comfortable with having a single leader? At Store Serve, the newly formed teams came to believe they could coordinate their internal work. But accomplishing the larger objective of shortening the product development timeframe to 5 months still remained a dreamlike fantasy. One director was assigned to oversee this project grouping of 25 teams, but he largely ignored the effort, choosing to focus on his functional job without paying any attention or even visiting the various teams. This lack of encouragement and support, much less what you expect in terms of monitoring and integrating the team efforts, will we don't normally consider shared leadership as a practical approach. Is that because it is inherently inferior to having individuals who encompass this entire skill set, or simply that we are accustomed to and comfortable with having a single leader? At StoreServe, the newly formed teams came to believe they could coordinate their internal work, but accomplishing the larger objective of shortening the product development timeframe to 5 months remained a dreamlike fantasy. One director was assigned to oversee this project grouping of 25 teams, but he largely ignored the effort, choosing to focus almost entirely on his functional job without paying any attention to or even visiting the various teams. The lack of encouragement and support, much less what you would expect in terms of monitoring and integrating the team efforts, was noticeable from the start. Clearly not a best practice, which only served to create a deepening sense of abandonment. Getting the job done inside each team was challenge enough. Of course, negotiating the overlapping issues across the 25 teams posed another, even greater challenge at a higher level. This is the one that had been abdicated by the director. After discussing with each team who could help coordinate these ongoing issues, several new volunteers would emerge with sufficient skills or interest among them to collectively take on what no single person had the skill or confidence to accomplish alone. Not only did the teams correctly determine which of the other teams they needed to interface with, which was typically 3 to 5, not all 25, just 3 to 5, but the volunteer connectors were successful in bridging overlaps and differences across those teams to work out practical compromises in the interest of the larger objective. Only 1 month into the project, this success at integrating the individual team efforts was really quite a surprise to everyone. Despite the newly discovered ability to move forward and handle differences without delays, there was still an almost complete disbelief that the new product could be developed anywhere close to this unrealistic 5-month deadline. While doubt remained, a new culture was emerging within this network. Things were getting done quickly and effectively. Benchmarks and timelines were being met. Engineers talked about how they were solving the technical problems with each other, how they were becoming energized to stay on task and move forward without the usual delays and second guessing from managers above them. They started talking about how much more they liked being in this organization, this temporary one, how much more effective they were, and how positive they felt about their accomplishments. Time flew quickly. Although it seemed like they had just started, 3.5 months had passed since these teams were formed, and they did it. Not only had they surpassed their unrealistic goal of 5 months, they absolutely destroyed the previous product development best of 13 months. Ultimately, they would beat their competitors to the marketplace, and more importantly, save all those jobs, thousands of jobs. Had they traveled for a brief time to an alternate organization universe? Had they done something highly unusual by providing good enough leadership and project skills in a uniquely shared way, and accomplished all this without the leadership talent typically required. Although tossed into leaderless teams, the simple step of detailing and assigning specific project coordination tasks among the members built the minimum requirements to meet an unthinkable challenge. Only a few months earlier, this basic team infrastructure was accomplished in less than a day, without experienced leaders, without extensive training, and in a climate without much support. How can this be explained? Was it because of what I'm calling the swarm effect? There was so much shared leadership. Is it possible that the team members felt more responsibility for the team's overall success, and that this was the secret sauce that turned an accident waiting to happen into the soap that floated? And was this the foundation necessary for success at the next level up? The inter-team connections and integration of effort required to synchronize and align the array of 25 feature sets. This second level is even more difficult to achieve in any company, even with top-notch team leaders and a competent and highly engaged overall project manager. These 25 teams quietly managed inter-team relationships and tasks as if they had a seasoned director actively engaged in managing all that. At each stage, there was no leader, no director, no highly skilled manager to integrate and align the many pieces. But the hidden benefit of more leaders, even partial leaders, is that it may be the key to enabling the swarm effect. I stumbled on a video of starling swarming and learned something about how they accomplish this that leads me to believe there may be a human analogy. Let me play this a couple of times. They move, reform, and reform based on avoiding the prey, and are able to stay together and coordinate as one group, as one entity. Research I found on how starlings are able to fly in these precise formations may actually shed light on how these store-served teams formed a collective leader. The research scientists wanted to find out how flocks remain so incredibly cohesive when under attack by a bird of prey. Over several years between 2004 and 2007, in a research project called Star Flag, that's the word star, the word flag, combined together, Star Flag. You can do a search on that if you want to know more. They gathered data on large flocks of starlings over the skies of Rome's railway station using complex photographic and computer simulation technologies. They were actually able to track individual birds as they developed their approach to doing this. Early computer models had assumed that each bird interacts with all birds within a certain near distance. But their findings indicated that each bird tracks a fixed number of 7 nearby, irrespective of how close or far away those 7 were. This was the secret of how they stick together. A flock under predator attack may expand dramatically, but birds can regroup very quickly because the cohesion does not depend on the physical distance among starlings, but rather on their ability to interact with this fixed number of 7. Is it possible that a similar direction-setting mechanism is evident at store-served when each team connects with that set of other teams, 3 to 5, that it has determined it must coordinate with? These connections had to be incredibly effective at resolving differences and making compromises to achieve the swarm-like integration of all 25 teams. Could it be that the team members who had this responsibility worked harder at it and devoted more time to it than would have a single team leader? Because the rest of the team was depending on them for this one task, did they put more of their focus and energy into inter-team connections than we might normally expect from a traditional team leader who has to take on all the leadership tasks. As I indicated earlier, the most visible missing player was at the next level up, the absentee project director. In a classic product development project, there is one manager to integrate all the team efforts. Knowing that ultimate responsibility rests with this overseer role may also relieve team leaders from exerting the level of energy and focus that emerged at StoreServe. That empty director slot was likely the motivating force for the StoreServe team members assigned to the interfaces to put more into it, knowing there would be no overall project manager to monitor their work or correct their mistakes. Absence was the catalyst for the swarm. The absence of this actively engaged project director was the catalyst for the swarm. The level of concentrated energy each team focused on their designated neighbors is just what the starlings were doing to stay alive. The swarm effect allows for leaderless direction and less hierarchy. Now, command and control hierarchical management exists because it does indeed set direction and allocate resources. But this system also brings with it the well-known bureaucratic inefficiencies, functional and siloed organization. And aren't most of the high-performing organization designs built on fewer hierarchical levels and more horizontal coordination across processes? Yep, it was an accident, but the StoreServe swarm became just that. For its short 3.5-month life, it was among the best of high-performing systems I have known. Are there other examples of shared leadership that might help us understand what occurred at StoreServe? Sometimes what appears leading edge today has actually been in play for decades. The concept of shared leadership is not new at all. In the late 60s, Procter & Gamble developed a team-based approach that built both technical and leadership skills within the team. Called a technician system, the general idea was to optimize the way the work technology and humans interacted for best effect. For example, suppose there are 3 separate jobs in a work team. Traditionally, one individual is responsible for and fulfills only one of those 3. On a technician team, all 3 individuals are trained and are capable of fulfilling the work of all 3 jobs. So this means that all 3 may work on the same task at a single point to eliminate a critical path bottleneck for the sake of completing the overall work most efficiently. But this was just the beginning in technician systems of a progression of learning new skills. Eventually, they are able to take on the coordinating and leadership tasks once owned by the supervisors. These include coordinating the inter-team and cross-functional interfaces that StoreServe was also able to manage effectively. Some of the teams evolved to the point that all the members achieved the highest level of leadership skills. This, of course, breeds a greater appreciation for the challenges of the work that the others do, a greater understanding of how the various tasks must fit together, and ultimately a much greater sense of cooperation. My friend at Procter & Gamble, an alumnus from Procter & Gamble, rather, Dave Hanna, writes the following about his first technician system experience and the relationship between the number of qualified leaders on a team and the performance of the 3 teams he was responsible for developing. Dave writes, in the initial year of operation, the team's production results were directly correlated to the number of team members who volunteered to be coordinators. The 9-coordinator team was the best performer. The 4-coordinator team was next, and the 1-coordinator team was third. Of course, all of these teams were high performers, and Procter & Gamble enjoyed productivity gains of 35 to 40% in the plants that embraced this high-performance system. 35 to 40%. A system that built more leaders who constantly focused on whatever needed to be done for the team's success. While store-serve shared leadership in a distributed way, it appears that the "we are all leaders and in it together" at both companies is the one common element leading to high performance. Now, for the $64,000 question. Can this swarm effect be duplicated in other organizations? Was store-serve a fluke, a lucky one-time occurrence? How do you develop the benefits of this kind of early orchestration that blossoms into the swarm effect? We know that consultants and mature companies are able to train team leaders and build a comprehensive team infrastructure to create high-performing teams. Not new, done all the time. But Procter & Gamble's high-performing technician teams took at least a year to get going and even more time to develop leaders, an array of leaders. This time-intensive process is not transferable to ad hoc project teams that have a short-term duration, like store-serve, like what you find in many high-tech companies today. So where do we start? Ironically, the missing leadership talent and initial confusion at store-serve was the catalyst for developing their swarm. The obvious talent weaknesses at store-serve actually serve to put a conscious effort into overcoming them, that the level of coordination was well above what is considered very good at most companies. Could it be that distributed teamwork, where everyone on the team has at least one leader task responsibility, is the secret ingredient that creates these superior inter-team connections, connections which are essential for achieving swarm capability? Certainly, eliminating team leaders is not a desired first step, but selectively allocating some of the leadership tasks across the team might be one of the ways to build swarm strength, team, and inter-team collaboration. There is one other important element to consider. Both store-serve and Procter & Gamble teams had an advantage which can't be overlooked. They were all co-located and could meet daily or weekly in the same room. This is no easy task to duplicate in today's dispersed and global environment. However, I suspect that building a virtual homeroom that simulates a team who are all in the same room working full-time on one project is an essential requirement in addition to building swarm strength, along with distributed leadership. It must be easy to enter, simulating the feeling of showing up at work with everyone together face-to-face. It must highlight the workflow interdependencies where all the project information papers the walls, quote-unquote papers the walls. It must have the tools to sustain the ongoing problem-solving and decision-making necessary to reduce dependency on managers for updates and interface problem-solving. But this is easily said, yet obviously much harder to do. While there are many more ways to connect today, they come with their own distractions and often too much information. We know social media has been successful at getting input from a large population quickly, but has not been very successful at providing focus or direction. More sophisticated collaborative and project tools are emerging, but it's often difficult to keep team members engaged on this online forum. More often, I'm told that email becomes the default standard for interaction. And these email threads become long, the continuity dissolves in overcrowded and cluttered inboxes. So team focus and efficiency that lays the foundation for building the swarm is lost. But if this virtual homeroom capability can be created, it greatly increases the chances that would allow distributed leadership and the swarm to take effect. The long-term benefit of the swarm is that it reduces dependency on hierarchical management to ensure accountability. It limits the silo effect and encourages cross-function engagement. Over time, it could be the catalyst to flatten organization structure as focus and accountability are managed from the bottom up as opposed to by the hierarchy. On reflection, what surprised me most at store-serve was that it caused organization change without the resistance I almost always encounter during change efforts. This got me thinking about approaching change a bit differently than I had in the past. The chances a change effort will succeed is described by the formula developed decades ago. In this classic formula, the success of a change initiative is driven by the gap between a vision of how things could be and dissatisfaction with the status quo. So a big motivation to change will come from being on a burning platform like StoreServe about to go under with a fabulous and compelling concept of what things could be like. So that's the energy for change. That gap is the energy. But to find success, this positive force must exceed the resistance that you will inevitably meet when you come to and go through a change process. When asked in the past to build a less hierarchical and siloed organization, I've followed a traditional change approach that's been grounded in participation from those most affected to understand their concerns. So information and ideas would come and I'd elicit them from the bottom up. But of course, decision-making and direction are still reserved for the executives who traditionally would tailor the inputs and authorize what does and what does not become part of the larger change initiative. Then, normally a team would be selected to do the design work, followed by more meetings to communicate the change. So typically, you would expect resistance, especially from some of the functional managers whose careers would be threatened, and perhaps many others whose daily routines would be changed. That alone would be sufficient for them to resist. So true, the frustration of being told what to do and the resistance that goes with it can be offset by the opportunity to influence the outcome and to take on new, more challenging responsibilities. But there's usually some ongoing pushback that goes with the terrain. And the journey is long. It's a time-consuming process. And often you hear, it gets in the way of doing my job. And indeed, the time commitment of those engaged in the change can be substantial. But what if the more basic survival approach taken at StoreServe is the path to change? Then the organization changes to become more interconnected and flatter without needing to advertise and develop a change strategy, without the heavy artillery required by the typical plan change process. If there's no need to introduce a change initiative, nothing to advertise to conjure up resistance, it's unlikely there will be a visible challenge to simply building team infrastructure. I learned about what I'll call an invisible change process years ago when the university I attended built a number of new structures. As you know, in most new construction projects, sidewalks are put in place when the building is completed to keep people off the grass. But if these sidewalks aren't positioned where folks are most likely to tread, the grass gets walked on anyway. Back then, instead of pouring sidewalks when they had finished construction, they waited until after the next winter when the paths that students naturally took had been clearly beaten across the lawns. That's where they put in the walkways. This was a lesson for me in creating infrastructure without generating resistance. Doesn't it look like a network there, not the usual grid you see when you're looking at how sidewalks are put in place? There was no conscious strategy to build a flatter network system at StoreServe. Dumped into teams, the mostly young engineers stared at what seemed to them an impossible challenge. There was no attempt to win them over to a new organizational concept. Would you call this an invisible change process? The network appearing as naturally as the sidewalk, as if that's the way it should be? Nothing special or unusual, nothing to object to or resist. Only the steps of building the team charter and distributing leadership tasks were front and center. If this process is seen as just helping me do my job, there could be some resistance to that element of new, but hardly as visible or tangible as a major restructuring. I'm not suggesting that there is some subversive approach to change that bypasses the folks affected, but I was impressed with the ease of building this network-led system. The StoreServe team members just wanted to keep their jobs. Those survival steps to develop distributed leadership transformed them into the swarm. I guess you could call that a change effort, but to use a medical terminology, it certainly looked more like a minimally invasive process. But to be realistic, there's one good reason to be skeptical about swarm proliferation. In addition to the normal resistance to any change effort, moving to a more networked and flatter organization confronts an even more formidable challenge, what I'll call the Great Management Wall. We know that self-managing networks that emerged decades ago at Procter & Gamble and in an ad hoc way at StoreServe do provide sufficient coordination and leadership to fill the supervisor and the project leader roles. But the biggest barrier comes from those managers who would be displaced because their jobs have been absorbed by the teams below them. This was true at Procter & Gamble decades ago and still is today. This amazingly high-performing system stalled beyond eliminating the first-line supervisor. It didn't go higher than that. Hierarchical progression may define the careers managers aspire to, but it does not necessarily correlate with the amount of management actually required to support the work. If teams can perform much of their own coordination, there is less or no need for immediate supervision, which means less or no need for as many managers. There may be good reason for staying with tradition when a manager, not the team, has a level of knowledge and experience to help solve problems, envision a possible path, determine direction, especially when the situation is unclear. But this determination is rarely addressed because we are conditioned to creating management jobs where we feel there needs to be accountability and one point of control, instead of thinking about building most of these tasks into the teams. So not assigning a project leader or management role creates the fear that there will be a loss of control with no one to ensure that the job gets done. It's overcoming this fear and the inertia of relying on one person to keep all the pieces together that's as big a barrier as our prevailing concept of what a successful career looks like. What can we conclude? An accident happened, a swarm formed, and a high-performance system emerged, albeit a temporary system. Astonishing success followed. Can this be intentionally duplicated in other organizations? I believe distributing leadership and building homeroom capability with exceptional inter-team connections are essential prerequisites. Those are the elements that create capability. But to move forward, the executives and managers who hover at the boundary must not just allow it, but embrace it. And for that to happen, they must believe that the performance of the organization will become exceptional because of it. That's what convinced executives at Procter & Gamble to promote the technician systems that had a 35 to 40% productivity gains over the traditional ones. Still, it's no doubt that the odds of swarming becoming best practice are stacked against it. Unlikely, yes, improbable, perhaps, but this doesn't mean it can't happen. We've seen that when a major corporation takes on a new way of organizing and demonstrates success, there are many others that follow. Witness the technician system at Procter & Gamble or Six Sigma at General Electric. It only takes one standing tall to start the wave or instigate a disruptive organizational approach. I end with a question for you to consider. What would you do if you saw a competitor starting to swarm near you? Thank you for listening. And now I hope you have some challenging questions for me.
Thank you, Ord, for this cutting-edge presentation. We do have some questions for you. Our first one is, how did the 25 StoreServe teams actually align their outputs? What was the process?
Well, each team had a fairly good understanding from the outset of who the 3 to 5 other teams were that it needed to coordinate with. Based on the performance features they knew they needed to be compatible with theirs. So remember, each team was responsible for only one new feature. In addition, there was an all-team meeting where they verified or modified this relationship, this specific array of inter-team overlaps. So they narrowed it down to, again, that 3 to 5, or confirmed it. Then a volunteer in each team would take on one of the other teams as their team needed to coordinate with. So they were responsible for only one other team that they were going to make sure they were compatible with. But because this one individual had this responsibility for their team, and because this was their only team responsibility, they certainly didn't want to let their fellow members down. So they put that extra effort in it to make it work. Of course, everyone knew that all these connections had to work for the overall effort to succeed. And so because of this burning platform where they all might lose their jobs, doing my job as a connector was just as critical as the others to keep my job and everyone else's.
Okay, thank you. Very good. How do you address senior management skepticism that the swarm effect can deliver?
Well, I assume by the question, we'll assume we don't have the best situation, which is an executive group that's open and willing to test a leading edge organization concept. So we start with skepticism. Well, if you have a project that has multiple teams, a well-defined endpoint and expected result, then you can still assign project team leaders and also do distributed leadership, as StoreServe did. You can divide up leadership tasks and not have the team leader do everything. It's not necessary to eliminate team leaders. The key is distributing leadership tasks. So this can all happen even under the executive radar if necessary, since the traditional leadership structure is retained. You just altered the set of tasks for team members. And if the results exceed executive expectations, that's the best way to address skepticism. Hey, by the way, this is what we did, and we've got these incredible results.
Okay, thank you. You talked about a virtual homeroom. How could you set up a virtual team with a distributed leadership model?
Well, you sure could. I mean, if you recall the process, it wasn't that complicated. We took the team through a standard chartering template, which people do online as well, and then we added the team leader assessment, the project allocation tasks, as a way of getting each of the team members to think about one or a few of the leader tasks they could take on. So this was all accomplished in 4 hours. There's no reason that can't be done virtually because it's not that complex.
Okay. Now, in the swarm, who do you go to that is answerable? How do you figure out who is accountable for what?
I'm very glad you asked this question because this is the biggest reason any organization will find it difficult to take a chance on the swarm. You know, even if they've heard it has high performance capacity. Now, as I indicated earlier, there's an inherent fear that if a single person is not accountable, a project will be out of control. It's very hard for us to conceive of a network being the controlling entity. So going back to StoreServe, none of the teams had a team leader. While there was a director named as the overall project manager, he focused on his day-to-day job, disregarding the project. If it hadn't been successful, no doubt he would have been the fall guy, but it was successful. The reality is that the teams were the team leaders, and the network of teams was the overall project manager. The network was the accountable entity. Yeah, it's an uncomfortable feeling for most, but the results are that this form of accountability may be more robust than our accustomed reliance on a single individual who gets either the accolades or the brain. So going back to Procter & Gamble's technician teams, recall that they developed more than one leader on the teams, and these self-directed teams replaced the first-line supervisors. The teams were the supervisor. It was a very uncomfortable feeling for most of management at Procter & Gamble when this was all initiated, well, nearly half a century ago. But the 35 to 40% productivity advantage of those systems soon turned discomfort into enthusiastic support. It's really understanding that the network is the accountable entity. It's just a way of doing things that we're not comfortable with.
Okay, very good. Well, Ord, we thank you again for your presentation. We will send each of our registrants a PDF of this presentation as a special bonus. Thank you again, Ord, for what you've presented to us this day. The session is now ended. and we thank you all for your attendance.